What if everything you thought you knew about the teachings of Jesus was just a sliver of the whole damn truth? What if, for centuries, ancient texts have been hidden away, locked up tight, guarding secrets that could absolutely blow the lid off our understanding of early Christianity? Today, we're gonna crack open one of the most controversial, most mind-bending documents in religious history, the Gospel of Thomas. A text the early church deep-sixed from the biblical canon, buried for 1,500 years, lost to the sands of time. This ain't just another lost gospel. This is a document that lays out a version of Jesus so radical, so far removed from the traditional image we've been fed, that its very existence challenges the bedrock of established Christian doctrine. While the canonical Gospels give us a Jesus speaking in parables and grand narratives, the Gospel of Thomas reveals a teacher dishing out direct, profound, and often enigmatic lessons, not for the masses, but for those disciples ready to handle the deeper knowledge. When archaeologists stumbled upon this text in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, alongside a whole library of Gnostic writings, the academic world went absolutely nuts. Here was tangible proof that alternative Christian traditions existed, versions of Jesus' message that had been systematically suppressed, scrubbed clean from official history. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't bother with the crucifixion or the resurrection. Instead, it focuses solely on the words and teachings of Jesus, painting him as a wisdom teacher whose main gig was to awaken the divine consciousness already humming inside every single human being. The real kicker for traditional religious authorities is that this gospel throws out concepts that directly contradict the need for ecclesiastical middlemen. Jesus, according to Thomas, taught that the kingdom of heaven isn't some distant vacation spot we get to after we kick the bucket, but a present reality we can tap into right here, right now, once we wake up to our true divine nature. That perspective was a direct threat to the power and authority of a church that was busy setting itself up as the only valid highway to salvation. The text is a collection of 114 sayings or logia, each one kicking off with "Jesus said," building a coherent yet radically different spiritual philosophy. These aren't easy reads. They demand contemplation, meditation, and an open mind that goes way beyond blind faith. These are teachings that invite the spiritual seeker to question everything, to dig deep into their own nature, and to unearth truths that transcend established doctrines. Scholars of ancient texts have pinned some of these teachings down to a period as early as the canonical Gospels, maybe even before. That means we're not talking about some late, heretical interpretations of the Christian message, but potentially some of the oldest words and teachings attributed to Jesus that have survived to this day. The implication is staggering. The version of Christianity we know might just be the result of a specific political and theological selection, not necessarily the only legitimate interpretation of the original message. To really grasp the historical weight of the Gospel of Thomas, we gotta dive into the messy context of early Christianity, a period far more diverse and complicated than the official story lets on. For the first few centuries after Jesus' death, there were multiple Christian communities, each with their own interpretations, practices, and sacred texts. There was no established orthodoxy, no fixed biblical canon, and certainly no central authority dictating which beliefs were legit and which were heresy. In this wild west of religious plurality, entire communities of early Christians found deep, transformative spiritual guidance in the teachings attributed to Thomas. These communities, later dubbed Gnostics by historians, cooked up an understanding of Christianity that emphasized direct knowledge of the divine, a personal experience of transcendence, and the revolutionary idea that every individual carries within them the divine spark Jesus came to ignite. If you want to be part of this fascinating deep dive into Christianity's hidden history and uncover more secrets that have been buried for centuries, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because we've got a whole series dedicated to blowing the lid off the deepest mysteries of ancient texts that changed the world. The Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, laid out a sophisticated cosmology that saw the material world as a temporary illusion, while true reality existed in the spiritual realm of pure knowledge. This wasn't some nihilistic or escapist viewpoint. Quite the opposite. It empowered individuals by teaching them they had direct access to divine wisdom without needing institutional gatekeepers. Jesus, in this tradition, wasn't so much a savior who died for humanity's sins, but an enlightened teacher who came to wake others up to their own divine nature. This fundamental difference in understanding Jesus' role was a direct threat to the ecclesiastical model that was shaping up in mainstream Christianity. If every person could directly access divine truth, if the kingdom of heaven was inside every individual just waiting to be discovered, then what the hell did you need a church hierarchy for? What justification was there for priests, bishops, and eventually the Pope as necessary go-betweens for God and humanity? The process by which certain texts made it into the biblical canon while others got branded as heresy wasn't some divinely inspired operation, as many believers assume. No, sir. It was a deeply political process that played out over several centuries and culminated in the ecumenical councils of the 4th century. The church leaders who came out on top in these doctrinal slugfests had motivations that went way beyond preserving pure theological truth. They were building an institution that needed authority, structure, and control to survive and thrive in a politically complex world. The manuscripts holding these alternative teachings didn't just vanish due to neglect or the passage of time. They were systematically hunted down, confiscated, and destroyed by those who saw them as an existential threat to the order they were trying to establish. The communities that preserved these texts faced active persecution, labeled as dangerous heretics corrupting the true faith. But some groups managed to stash their most prized texts, burying them in clay jars in remote desert spots, hoping that someday future generations might rediscover these lost teachings. This desperate act of preservation would turn out to be one of the most significant events in the history of biblical studies, even if it took over 1,500 years for its full importance to hit home. The theological differences between the Christianity we know today and the Christianity in the Gospel of Thomas run way deeper than simple variations in interpretation. While Orthodox Christianity developed a theology centered on salvation through faith in the crucified and resurrected Christ, the traditions preserved in Thomas offered a path to spiritual enlightenment that hinged on direct knowledge and personal experience of the divine. This wasn't just some academic squabble. It had revolutionary implications for how individuals connected with the sacred and how religious communities organized themselves. In the world Thomas laid out, every person had the inherent potential to reach the same level of spiritual illumination that Jesus had achieved, fundamentally transforming the relationship between teacher and student, between the human and the divine. The cosmology presented in these alternative texts suggested that the material universe we experience through our senses is just a shadow of a deeper, truer reality. This perspective, later dubbed Gnosticism by scholars, didn't completely reject the physical world, but saw it as a veil obscuring deeper truths. Followers of these teachings developed sophisticated meditative and contemplative practices designed to pierce this veil and directly experience the underlying spiritual reality. Jesus in this tradition hadn't come to die for humanity's sins in the conventional sense, but to teach others how to awaken to their own divine nature and transcend the limitations of ordinary existence. These doctrinal differences inevitably created friction with the forms of Christianity that would eventually become orthodox. The leaders of the emerging churches, who were trying to establish uniform doctrines and coherent hierarchical structures, saw these alternative teachings not just as theological errors, but as direct threats to the institutional authority they were building. If individuals could access divine truth directly, if the kingdom of heaven really was inside every person just waiting to be discovered, then the need for religious intermediaries became questionable. This fundamental tension between direct spiritual experience and mediated institutional authority would become one of the defining conflicts in the history of early Christianity. The texts that have come down to us suggest these alternative communities weren't fringe groups or cults, but vibrant, sophisticated Christian traditions with their own theological schools, their own liturgical practices, and their own interpretations of Jesus' teachings. They had their own gospels, their own wisdom texts, and their own oral traditions that, they claimed, stretched back to the apostles themselves. The idea that there was only one correct form of Christianity, pure and unbroken from Jesus to the 4th century leaders, is a retrospective construct that doesn't reflect the real diversity of the early Christian movement. The process by which certain texts got canonized while others were tossed out didn't follow purely theological or historical criteria. Political factors, institutional alliances, and power struggles played decisive roles in determining which version of Christianity would survive as orthodox. and which would be relegated to the heresy pile. The religious leaders who emerged victorious from these conflicts didn't just decide which books made it into the Bible. They also wrote the subsequent histories that would justify their decisions and legitimize their authority. Texts that contradicted these official narratives were not only excluded from the canon, but actively suppressed and, in many cases, physically destroyed. The accidental preservation of some of these lost texts in the Egyptian desert has allowed modern scholars to piece together a more complete picture of early Christian diversity. These discoveries have revealed that the differences between various Christian traditions ran far deeper than previously understood, and that the teachings preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas represented not late deviations from a pure original Christianity, but parallel traditions that may have been just as old and authentic as those that eventually became orthodox. This realization has fundamentally transformed our understanding of Christian origins and raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of religious authority and the legitimacy of institutions that claim exclusive interpretation of spiritual truth. The transformation of the original Christian message didn't happen overnight or by accident. It was the result of a gradual, deliberate process that stretched across several centuries. Specialists in early Christian history have documented how teachings emphasizing direct spiritual experience and inner authority were systematically replaced by doctrines that privileged institutional authority and clerical mediation. This wasn't just a theological debate, it reflected fundamental shifts in the social and political structure of the Mediterranean world. As Christianity expanded from its origins as a spiritual renewal movement within Judaism to become an imperial religion, the pressure to establish doctrinal uniformity and administrative hierarchies dramatically intensified. The texts that survived this transformation allow us to trace the process by which core concepts of the Christian message were reinterpreted to serve new institutional purposes. The kingdom of heaven, which in the Gnostic Gospels appears as a present reality accessible through inner knowledge, was gradually recontextualized as a future promise dependent on participating in sacraments administered by the institutional church. Salvation, originally presented as a spiritual awakening that could happen in this life, was pushed off until after death and conditioned on adherence to specific creeds and obedience to ecclesiastical authorities. This process of institutionalization wasn't unique to Christianity, but the specifics of how it played out had profound consequences for the later evolution of the Christian tradition. The communities that preserved the alternative teachings faced increasing persecution, not only from Roman authorities, but also from other Christian groups that had adopted more hierarchical structures and rigid doctrines. Historical records suggest that these internal persecutions were often more brutal than those directed against Christians by the Roman state, because they involved not only issues of political power, but also spiritual legitimacy. The leaders of the emerging churches needed to establish their exclusive authority over the interpretation of Jesus' teachings, and the existence of alternative traditions claiming equal or greater authenticity represented an existential threat to their claims of divine authority. The preservation of the Gospel of Thomas and other similar texts in the sands of the Egyptian desert wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Scholars have determined that these documents were carefully packaged and buried by communities who knew their sacred texts were doomed to destruction. The dates of these burials align with periods of heightened persecution against non-Orthodox Christian traditions, suggesting these communities took desperate measures to preserve their teachings for future generations. The fact that they chose to bury these texts rather than try to hide them in more accessible places indicates they understood that suppression would be total and prolonged, and that the only hope of preservation lay in entrusting these documents to the desert itself. Reading these rediscovered texts reveals not just doctrinal differences, but fundamentally distinct approaches to the nature of religious experience and spiritual authority. While the Christianity that eventually became Orthodox emphasized the importance of faith as acceptance of specific doctrinal propositions, the traditions preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas prioritized direct knowledge and transformative experience. This difference wasn't merely academic. It had profound practical implications for how these communities organized themselves and how they understood the purpose of spiritual life. Gnostic communities tended to be more egalitarian in their leadership structures, more open to female participation in roles of spiritual authority, and more tolerant of interpretive diversity on doctrinal matters. The methods used to suppress these alternative traditions were sophisticated and multifaceted. They weren't limited to the physical destruction of texts. They included rewriting histories, systematically demonizing alternative leaders, and crafting narratives that presented orthodox traditions as the only genuinely apostolic ones. The leaders of the emerging church developed elaborate doctrinal genealogies that traced lines of apostolic succession, deliberately excluding the traditions we now know through the Gnostic texts. These historical constructs were later codified in official creeds and theological treatises that established not only what Christians should believe, but also which traditions they should consider heretical and dangerous. The irony of this whole process is that many of the teachings suppressed as heretical may have represented older traditions, closer to the historical teachings of Jesus, than those that were ultimately canonized as orthodox. Modern critical studies have suggested that some of the sayings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas may derive from sources earlier than the canonical Gospels, and that certain spiritual practices associated with Gnostic traditions may reflect aspects of early Christianity that were later edited or reinterpreted in canonical literature. This possibility raises deep questions about the nature of religious authority and whether institutions claiming to represent a specific tradition necessarily have privileged access to that tradition's original teachings. The implications of these discoveries stretch far beyond purely historical or academic concerns. The rediscovery of these suppressed voices has inspired many contemporary spiritual seekers to reconsider their own approaches to religious experience and to question the exclusive authority of established religious institutions. The central message of the Gospel of Thomas, that the divine kingdom exists within each person and can be accessed directly through inner knowledge, resonates powerfully with contemporary spiritual sensibilities that prioritize personal experience over institutional authority. This resonance isn't accidental. Rather, it reflects perennial tensions between direct spiritual experience and institutionally mediated religion, tensions that have persisted throughout the entire history of Christianity and continue to manifest in contemporary spiritual traditions. The consequences of these historical decisions stretched far beyond the purely theological realm, fundamentally shaping how Christianity evolved as both a spiritual tradition and a social institution. When we examine the long-term effects of suppressing texts like the Gospel of Thomas, we can observe how these early choices molded not only official Christian doctrines, but also attitudes toward spiritual authority, mystical experience, and the very nature of salvation. The early centuries of Christianity witnessed a gradual yet decisive transformation from a religion characterized by diverse interpretations and practices to a more uniform hierarchical system that emphasized doctrinal conformity and institutional obedience. This transformation didn't occur in a vacuum. Rather, it was driven by specific political, social, and economic factors that influenced how Christian leaders conceptualized their mission and organized their communities. The alliance between the Christian Church and the Roman Empire under Constantine represented a critical turning point in this process, providing both the opportunities and the incentives to establish a unified version of Christianity that could serve as a cohesive element within a diverse and often fragmented empire. The political benefits of this alliance were immense for both parties, but they came with significant compromises that fundamentally altered the character of the early Christian movement. The adoption of Christianity as the empire's official religion created immense pressures to develop doctrinal and administrative structures that could function effectively on an imperial scale. This meant that Christian traditions emphasizing individual spiritual experience, personal interpretation of scriptures, or decentralized forms of community organization became problematic from an administrative perspective. Imperial authorities needed religious partners who could guarantee doctrinal uniformity, maintain social discipline, and provide ideological legitimacy for the existing political system. Traditions represented by texts like the Gospel of Thomas, with their emphasis on direct knowledge and individual spiritual authority, were inherently incompatible with these administrative requirements. The process of institutionalizing Christianity also required the creation of clear hierarchies of authority that could make binding decisions on doctrinal and disciplinary matters. This entailed the development of theological systems that justified these hierarchical structures as divinely ordained and spiritually necessary. Texts and traditions suggesting that all individuals had direct access to spiritual truth, or that religious authority could be derived from inner experience rather than institutional ordination, represented fundamental challenges to these organizational developments. The suppression of these alternative traditions wasn't simply a matter of theological preference. but a practical necessity for the functioning of an institutionalized church, operating in alliance with political power. The implications of these decisions extended deeply into the spiritual lives of ordinary Christians, fundamentally altering how individuals related to the divine and understood their own spiritual potential. The tradition represented by the Gospel of Thomas had emphasized each person's inherent capacity to access divine wisdom directly through self-knowledge and inner contemplation. This perspective posited that spiritual transformation was possible without institutional intermediation and that ultimate religious authority resided in an individual's personal experience with the divine. The suppression of these ideas and their replacement with systems emphasizing clerical mediation and doctrinal conformity represented a fundamental shift in Christian understanding of human nature and spiritual potential. This shift had particular consequences for certain groups within early Christian communities, especially for women, whose roles in spiritual leadership were progressively limited as the church adopted more hierarchical and patriarchal structures. Gnostic texts, including some sayings within the Gospel of Thomas, had preserved traditions recognizing female spiritual authority and featuring female figures as recipients and transmitters of divine revelation. The marginalization of these traditions coincided with the systematic exclusion of women from formal leadership roles in the institutional church, a development that reflected both Greco-Roman cultural influences and specific theological decisions regarding the nature of spiritual authority. The loss of these alternative perspectives also impacted the Christian understanding of the relationship between spiritual experience and intellectual knowledge. The Gospel of Thomas had preserved teachings that integrated spiritual seeking with forms of knowledge transcending ordinary discursive thought, emphasizing types of understanding that emerged from direct contemplation and inner experience. Later Christian tradition, influenced by particular Hellenic philosophies and the needs of systematic doctrinal teaching, tended to privilege more rational and propositional forms of religious knowledge, frequently reducing mystical experience to secondary or exceptional phenomena, rather than recognizing it as central to spiritual life. This transformation in the Christian understanding of spiritual knowledge had lasting implications for the development of Christian theology and for how later Christians conceptualized the relationship between faith and experience. Traditions that had emphasized the importance of direct experiential knowledge were gradually replaced by systems that prioritized the acceptance of doctrinal propositions and conformity with official teachings. While Christian tradition never fully lost its mystical dimension, these currents were frequently marginalized or required special justification within theological frameworks that fundamentally privileged other forms of religious authority. The modern recovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas has allowed scholars to reconstruct some of the diversity that characterized early Christianity and better understand the alternatives suppressed during the institutionalization process. This recovery process has revealed not only the existence of alternative Christian traditions, but also the specific mechanisms through which certain interpretations were privileged over others. Contemporary studies have shown that many characteristics later Christian leaders identified as distinctive heresies of Gnostic groups were actually more widely distributed in early Christianity than previously recognized, suggesting that the line between orthodoxy and heresy was established retroactively rather than determined by inherent doctrinal differences. This understanding has led many scholars to reconsider traditional narratives about Christian origins and to recognize the extent to which later versions of Christianity were shaped by specific historical contingencies rather than an inevitable internal logic. The possibility that alternative traditions, such as those preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, might represent legitimate and ancient developments of Christian thought, has raised fundamental questions about the authority of established Christian institutions and the criteria that should be used to evaluate spiritual authenticity. The historical documentation surviving to our day offers compelling evidence about the specific methods used to suppress alternative Christian traditions during the early centuries CE. Manuscripts discovered at Nag Hammadi and other archaeological sites have revealed that the elimination of texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, wasn't an accidental or natural process, but the result of systematic campaigns designed to eradicate perspectives challenging emerging institutional authority. Historical sources document how ecclesiastical leaders developed sophisticated strategies to discredit and destroy traditions they deemed problematic, employing both theological arguments and political and social pressure to achieve their objectives. Patristic records reveal that figures like Irenaeus of Lyon developed elaborate refutations of the teachings contained in texts like the Gospel of Thomas, systematically characterizing them as dangerous deviations from true Christian faith. These refutations weren't limited to abstract theological arguments but included specific warnings about the spiritual and social dangers these alternative traditions supposedly posed. Contemporary studies have shown that many of these characterizations were exaggerated or distorted, presenting caricatured versions of the teachings they purported to refute, rather than addressing their actual contents with academic precision. Archaeological evidence suggests that the suppression of these texts involved both the physical destruction of manuscripts and the prohibition of their copying and distribution. Analyses of manuscript preservation patterns indicate that texts like the Gospel of Thomas survived primarily in peripheral regions where institutional control was less effective, while almost completely disappearing from urban centers where ecclesiastical authority had managed to firmly establish itself. This geographical distribution of manuscript survival provides indirect evidence regarding the effectiveness of suppression campaigns and the strategies used to implement them. Administrative documents preserved in later ecclesiastical archives reveal that the elimination of alternative traditions required coordinated efforts spanning several centuries. Conciliar decisions and episcopal letters document deliberative processes in which Christian leaders specifically identified which texts and teachings were to be suppressed, developing theological and practical criteria to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable materials. These documents show that the formation of the official Christian canon wasn't simply the recognition of texts that already held universal authority, but a complex political process in which certain perspectives were deliberately excluded to promote particular visions of Christian identity and authority. Research into manuscript transmission has revealed that some texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, continue to be copied and studied in marginal Christian communities long after being officially banned, suggesting that their suppression was never entirely successful. Philological analyses of textual variations in these later manuscripts indicate that the communities preserving them maintained sophisticated and developed interpretative traditions, contradicting claims that these perspectives merely represented ignorant or superficial deviations from established Christian orthodoxy. Comparative studies have shown that the strategies used to suppress alternative Christian traditions were similar to methods employed by other religious and political institutions to consolidate their authority during the same historical period. Techniques of pejorative characterization, social exclusion, destruction of sources, and rewriting historical narratives followed patterns observable in other contexts of institutional competition, suggesting that conflicts over texts like the Gospel of Thomas reflected broader power dynamics than the specific doctrinal differences often emphasized in traditional accounts. Available documentation indicates that the suppression of these traditions had lasting consequences for the development of Christian thought, eliminating not only specific texts, but also the interpretative traditions and communities of practice that had sustained them. Analyses of later Christian literature reveal that many theological and spiritual questions previously explored in texts like the Gospel of Thomas simply disappeared from mainstream Christian discussion, creating gaps in Christian reflection that persisted for centuries. This loss of intellectual and spiritual diversity may have impoverished the Christian tradition in ways only now beginning to be fully appreciated by contemporary scholars. Evidence also suggests that the suppression of alternative traditions required the construction of revised historical narratives that retroactively legitimized institutional decisions that had been made. Later patristic texts present versions of Christian origins that systematically minimize the diversity characterizing early Christian communities, creating the impression that doctrinal and institutional uniformity had existed since apostolic times. Modern studies have demonstrated that these historical narratives were ideological constructions designed to justify the institutional status quo rather than accurate descriptions of actual historical developments. The control mechanisms established during this canonization process reveal a sophisticated strategy for managing religious knowledge that fundamentally transformed the nature of Christianity as a spiritual tradition. Research has identified that the systematic exclusion of texts like the Gospel of Thomas wasn't an isolated event, but part of a comprehensive reorganization of religious authority structures that prioritized institutional uniformity over experiential diversity. Analyses of correspondence between ecclesiastical leaders of the period reveal explicit concerns about the potentially disruptive effects of allowing individual Christians to directly interpret texts emphasizing immediate personal experience of the divine. Documentary sources indicate that many religious leaders recognized that the teachings contained in the Gospel of Thomas could inspire forms of spiritual life that would operate independently of emerging institutional structures, posing a fundamental challenge to the models of clerical authority consolidating during this crucial period of Christian history. This concern for institutional control manifested in the evolution of liturgical and educational practices that accompanied the exclusion of alternative texts. Liturgical studies have shown that texts incorporated into the official canon tended to emphasize themes of obedience, hierarchical structure, and clerical mediation, while texts like the Gospel of Thomas were excluded, precisely because they promoted concepts of direct access to spiritual experience that could function independently of institutional oversight. Research into early Christian education reveals that instructional programs were deliberately structured to emphasize individual believers' dependence on authorized interpretation provided by institutional leaders, creating knowledge systems that discouraged independent exploration of alternative spiritual sources. Comparative analyses with other religious traditions of the same period suggest that these control strategies reflected broader patterns of institutional consolidation that characterized the development of many religious organizations during late antiquity, indicating that conflicts over specific texts were part of more extensive social and political transformations, reshaping authority structures across multiple cultural contexts. Historical documentation also reveals that the effective suppression of traditions like those represented in the Gospel of Thomas required the construction of alternative systems of spiritual meaning that could satisfy the religious needs these texts had previously addressed. Evidence suggests that Christian communities losing access to traditions of direct experience developed compensatory forms of religious practice that emphasized mediated devotion, structured ritual participation, and adherence to specific doctrinal formulations as substitutes for the types of personal spiritual exploration characteristic of the suppressed traditions. Studies on the evolution of Christian mysticism indicate that spiritual currents emphasizing direct experience never fully disappeared, but were channeled into forms of expression compatible with dominant institutional structures, frequently through monastic and contemplative movements operating under official ecclesiastical oversight. However, research also suggests that these institutional adaptations never fully captured the more radical elements of the original traditions, creating persistent tensions within Christianity between impulses toward direct experience and the requirements of institutional conformity. Contemporary analyses of the long-term impact of these institutional decisions reveal that the exclusion of perspectives represented in the Gospel of Thomas had consequences extending far beyond the specific religious realm, influencing broader patterns of Western thought on fundamental themes such as the nature of authority, the relationship between individual experience and social institutions, and the criteria for validating diverse forms of knowledge. Interdisciplinary research has demonstrated that the strategies employed to establish Christian orthodoxy provided models for the institutional control of knowledge that were subsequently adopted by other social organizations, including educational, political, and cultural institutions, facing similar challenges of internal diversity and competition from alternative sources of authority. Studies in Western intellectual history suggest that the methods developed to suppress alternative Christian traditions contributed to the development of broader conceptual frameworks that systematically prioritized institutionally controllable forms of knowledge over those emerging from independent personal or communal experiences. This extended historical influence raises significant questions about how decisions made during the early centuries of Christianity continued to shape authority structures and knowledge systems in contexts far removed from their specific religious origins. Evidence suggests that the patterns of exclusion characterizing the suppression of the Gospel of Thomas set precedents for the institutional management of intellectual diversity that persisted through multiple social and cultural transformations, contributing to the development of what some scholars have characterized as a Western culture of institutional conformity. This contrasts markedly with traditions of individual exploration that had been characteristic of many earlier spiritual and philosophical currents. Analyses of the long-term consequences reveal that the loss of these alternative traditions may have limited the development of conceptual and practical resources that could have been valuable for addressing contemporary challenges related to integrating personal experience and social structure, navigating cultural and religious diversity, and developing forms of authority capable of accommodating multiple valid sources of knowledge and understanding. Modern research has also revealed that the rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas has provided unique opportunities to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of Christian historical development and the alternatives that might have existed had institutional decisions been different. Comparative studies between the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas and later developments in other spiritual traditions have identified surprising convergences, suggesting that suppressed perspectives from early Christianity shared important elements with currents of thought that developed independently in other cultural contexts. This indicates that the ideas contained in these texts represented universal human possibilities rather than specific sectarian deviations from Orthodox Christianity. These convergences raise provocative questions about whether the suppression of alternative Christian traditions deprived Western culture of spiritual and intellectual resources that could have facilitated more productive dialogues between different religious and philosophical traditions during later periods of intercultural contact. Contemporary analyses of the specific content of the Gospel of Thomas in relation to modern spiritual and existential challenges reveal that many of the perspectives contained in this text continue to be relevant for individuals seeking alternatives to conventional forms of religious authority and spiritual practice. Research into contemporary spiritual movements has identified that core concepts from the Gospel of Thomas, particularly those related to direct experience of the divine and individual responsibility for spiritual growth, have emerged independently in multiple modern contexts, suggesting that these ideas address fundamental human needs that transcend specific historical and cultural configurations. Psychological studies on spiritual experiences have confirmed that the types of consciousness states and perspectives on reality described in the Gospel of Thomas correspond to phenomena that continue to be reported by individuals from diverse cultural and religious backgrounds, providing empirical evidence for the experiential validity of the traditions that were suppressed during the development of institutional Christianity. This convergence between ancient texts and contemporary experiences raises important questions about the wisdom of historical decisions that removed these perspectives from the mainstream of Christian and Western thought. Exploring these connections has also revealed that the rediscovery of suppressed Christian traditions can contribute significantly to contemporary efforts to develop more inclusive and experientially grounded approaches to spirituality and religious practice that can accommodate the diversity of experiences and perspectives characterizing modern pluralistic societies. Research into innovations in contemporary spiritual practice has identified that elements derived from the Gospel of Thomas and similar texts are being successfully integrated into frameworks that honor both individual exploration and communal participation, suggesting that these ancient traditions can provide valuable resources for navigating modern tensions between personal autonomy and social belonging. Studies on interfaith dialogue have also shown that perspectives preserved in suppressed Christian texts often provide more productive points of contact for mutual understanding between different religious traditions than the orthodox doctrinal formulations that emerged from the process of canonization, indicating that the suppressed diversity within Christianity could have facilitated more harmonious relationships between Christians and adherents of other spiritual traditions, if it had been allowed to develop historically without institutional restriction. Thanks for watching this video all the way through. I'll catch you in the next one.